When I first bought my house by Clearwater Lake, it felt like a dream. The water shimmered at sunrise, the wind carried the smell of pine, and there was just enough space between properties to feel private without feeling isolated. I bought a little fishing boat a few weeks after moving in and moored it at the edge of my backyard. It wasn't anything fancy, just an aluminum rowboat with an old outboard motor, but it was mine. On weekends, I'd take it out early, cast a line, and watch the mist burn off the water as the sun came up. For 6 months, life was perfect. Then came the letter. It was taped to my door one Wednesday morning. Notice of violation, it read in bold red letters. According to the neighborhood association, my boat was in violation of aesthetic standards and needed to be removed within 10 days, or I would be fined $200 per day until I complied. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Remove my boat? It was tied to my own dock, on my own property, not hurting anyone. I called the number at the bottom of the letter and got a woman named Sheila, who introduced herself as the HOA compliance officer. You can't be serious, I said after explaining the situation. It's a boat on a lake. Where else am I supposed to keep it? Sir, she said in a voice so flat it made my teeth hurt, the HOA covenants are clear. No watercraft may be stored on the shoreline unless it is pre-approved by the board. Your boat has not been approved, so approve it. I snapped. She actually laughed. There's a waiting list for approved mooring spots, and we are currently full. You'll have to remove it or face fines. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. That weekend, I attended the next HOA meeting, determined to plead my case. I sat through 30 minutes of mind-numbing budget talk before they finally opened the floor. I explained my situation and even offered to pay a reasonable fee if that's what they wanted. Sheila was there, sitting next to the HOA president, a stocky man named Carl with a permanently irritated expression. We can't make exceptions, she said sweetly. If we allow you to keep your boat, then everyone will want to keep theirs. It will be chaos. There are only 4 houses with docks on this side of the lake, I said. Chaos seems unlikely, Carl smirked. Rules are rules, he said. Remove the boat or we start fining you. The room was quiet. A few neighbors looked sympathetic, but no one spoke up. I went home furious. I considered moving the boat just to avoid the hassle, but every time I looked out at the water, I got angrier. The lake was the reason I'd bought this place. I wasn't about to let a handful of self-important busybodies take that away from me. A week later, fate handed me the perfect opportunity. I was chatting with my neighbor, an older man named Hank who'd lived there since the early 90s. When I mentioned the HOA fight, he snorted. They can't tell you what to do with that boat, he said. Sure they can, I muttered. They've got bylaws and covenants. Yeah, for the neighborhood, Hank interrupted. But they don't own the lake. That made me pause. They don't? Nope. The lake's technically private, but it's not part of the HOA common property. Far as I know, it belongs to Clearwater Development LLC. They just let the neighborhood use it. That night, I did some digging. A few hours on the county property records site, and sure enough, Hank was right. The lake wasn't owned by the HOA, it was owned by a holding company that had gone defunct 2 years ago. The property was listed as delinquent for unpaid taxes. The next morning, I called the county assessor's office. After a few phone calls and some paperwork, I learned that the entire lake, all 27 acres of it, was headed for a tax lien auction the following month. I could hardly breathe as I hung up the phone. Over the next few weeks, I scraped together everything I could in savings, a small personal loan, even sold an old motorcycle. The auction day came, and I sat in the county office with my heart pounding as the bidding started. To my surprise, hardly anyone bid. It wasn't like buying lakefront lots. The lake itself wasn't easily developable. By the end of the auction, I was the winning bidder. Just like that, I owned Clearwater Lake. I waited until the deed arrived in the mail before I made my next move. Then, with a smile I couldn't wipe off my face, I sent a certified letter to the HOA. To whom it may concern, it read, as the legal owner of Clearwater Lake, I am hereby granting myself permanent and exclusive rights to moor watercraft at my property without the need for HOA approval. Please update your records accordingly. The response came fast. Carl called me personally, his voice full of forced politeness. What do you mean you own the lake? He asked. Exactly what it sounds like, I said. Check the county records if you don't believe me. There was a long silence. This doesn't change HOA policy, he said finally. Oh, it changes everything, I replied. And you might want to tell your compliance officer to stop harassing me, or I'll have to reconsider public access for HOA events. Carl sputtered something about lawyers and hung up. I went down to the dock that evening, untied my boat, and took it out for a long, slow lap around the lake. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel angry. I felt powerful, but I had no idea just how far the HOA was willing to push back, or how much fun I was about to have holding all the cards. For a few weeks after that phone call, things were quiet. Too quiet. I knew Carl and Sheila weren't going to just accept this, but part of me hoped they might back down and let things go. That hope died the morning I found a stack of envelopes in my mailbox, one for me, and identical ones for every house along the lake. The letter was written on HOA letterhead and signed by Carl himself. Effective immediately, it said. The HOA board has voted to ban all private watercraft from Clearwater Lake due to safety concerns. Violators will be fined $500 per occurrence. Furthermore, HOA-sponsored events at the lake will be suspended until further notice. I laughed out loud. It was an empty threat. They had no authority over the lake now. But I knew most of the neighbors wouldn't realize that. Sure enough, by that afternoon, I had 2 separate neighbors knock on my door asking if I had heard the news. They can't do that, I told them. They don't own the lake, I do, which means their ban is worthless. Word started to spread. People were confused. Some were angry, not at me, but at the HOA for messing with their summer plans. The fishing derby, the annual canoe race, the 4th of July picnic, all canceled. A week later, I got a formal letter from an attorney representing the HOA. It claimed that my ownership of the lake was in dispute and that I was required to cease all exclusive use of the property until the matter was resolved. I took the letter straight to my own attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Dana, who loved nothing more than taking HOA boards down a peg. This is nonsense, she said after skimming the letter. You bought the lake legally at auction. Their covenants can't override county deeds. If anything, you have the right to charge them for using it. That gave me an idea. 2 days later, I had my lawyer draft a formal lake use agreement and send it to the HOA. It offered them continued community access to the lake for a price. A very fair price, I thought. Just enough to cover liability insurance and maintenance. Carl called me the next day, seething. You can't just start charging us to use the lake, he snapped. I can, actually, I said, but I'm giving you a discount because I'm a nice guy. This is extortion. No, Carl. Extortion would be doubling the fee every month until you personally apologize for harassing me about my boat. This is just business. He hung up on me. That weekend, I posted bright new signs around the lake. Private property, access by permission only. I also chained off the small HOA-owned parking lot at the public trail entrance. You would have thought I had declared war. On Monday morning, I looked out my window and saw Sheila standing at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, glaring at my dock. An hour later, Carl drove by slowly, stopping just long enough to take pictures. Then came the emergency HOA meeting. I didn't plan to attend, but one of my neighbors begged me to come explain things. So I did, and it was glorious. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only. People were angry, shouting over one another. Carl banged his little gavel until the room quieted down. This man, Carl said, pointing at me like I was a criminal, is trying to hold this neighborhood hostage. He thinks he can force us to pay him to use the lake we've always used for free. I stood slowly and let the room settle. No, I said. I'm not holding anyone hostage. I'm the one who saved the lake. If I hadn't bought it, it would have been auctioned off to some developer who might have drained it or fenced it off or turned it into a private club. I'm offering you a way to keep using it, legally, and I'm the one taking on the liability and maintenance costs. A murmur ran through the room. People started whispering to one another. Don't listen to him, Sheila said. This is about power, not preservation. He's mad because we told him to move his boat. That made me laugh. You're right, Sheila. I was mad. But you know what? If you'd just let me keep my boat where it was, none of this would have happened. You started this. I just finished it. For once, Carl didn't have a snappy comeback. The meeting ended in chaos. Some neighbors stormed out. Others came up to me quietly and thanked me for standing up to the board. The next morning, I woke up to find someone had thrown eggs at my dock and slashed one of my boat's tires on the trailer. I knew exactly who was behind it, but I didn't call the police. Not yet. Instead, I installed security cameras, good ones, all around the property. Then I waited. It didn't take long. 2 nights later, just after midnight, my cameras caught someone creeping onto my dock with a pair of bolt cutters, clearly planning to cut my boat loose. The next morning, I emailed the footage to Dana. Within hours, she had filed for a restraining order against both Carl and Sheila, just in case, but I wasn't done yet. I called a contractor and had them deliver a large floating platform, a raft big enough for a few chairs and a cooler. I anchored it right in the middle of the lake and put up a sign, "Private Island, owners use only, every weekend." I rowed out there, drank a beer, and waved at the people standing on shore glaring at me. By midsummer, half the neighborhood was fed up with the HOA. People started showing up at meetings demanding Carl's resignation. Sheila stopped driving past my house entirely. And me? I started thinking about how much more fun I could have with my new lake, and how far I was willing to go to teach them a final lesson. By late July, the HOA was in full meltdown mode. The restraining order I'd filed had thrown Carl and Sheila into a frenzy, claiming I was abusing the legal system to silence them. But the video footage of someone sneaking onto my property was hard to argue with. A week later, my lawyer forwarded me a cease and desist letter from the HOA's attorney, demanding I restore full community access to Clearwater Lake and remove my signs immediately. Dana sent back a single-page response that said, "No, that's when Carl escalated. He sent out a neighborhood-wide email accusing me of stealing the lake and warned that property values would plummet because of my selfishness." The irony wasn't lost on me. If anything, my ownership meant no developer could ever buy up the lake and ruin the view. Still, I could feel the tension rising. People were starting to pick sides. Some neighbors ignored me completely, while others began walking over in the evenings to chat, quietly thanking me for keeping the lake natural and clean. That gave me an idea. The next weekend, I held a barbecue, right on my dock. I put up a big sign at the end of my driveway that said, "Lake Access Meeting, all welcome." Word spread fast. By the time the food was ready, half the neighborhood had shown up. Curious to see what I had planned, I stood on my dock, drink in hand, and made an announcement. "Folks," I said, "I didn't buy this lake to keep it all to myself. I just wanted to be left alone to enjoy it. But since the HOA can't seem to let that happen, I'm offering a deal. Anyone who wants to use the lake can sign a private access agreement with me. It'll cost you $50 a year, just enough to cover insurance." And guess what? There's no waiting list, no committee approval, no harassment about your boat or kayak. You just get to use the lake. The crowd buzzed with excitement. People lined up at my porch table where I had forms printed out. By the end of the night, I had over 20 households signed up, more than half the HOA. Carl showed up halfway through, his face red with fury. "You can't do this," he barked, standing at the edge of my yard. I smiled. "I'm not doing anything illegal. This is a private agreement between me and my neighbors. You don't own the lake, Carl, I do. Which means you can't stop this," he stormed off, muttering about lawsuits. The next day, I had a contractor install a proper floating dock on the far side of the lake with a small sign, "Members Only Access." I even added a kayak rack and a picnic bench. The members loved it. Suddenly, they had their own private retreat away from the HOA drama. Carl must have realized he was losing control because a few days later, I saw workers unloading posts and fencing near the community trail entrance. They were planning to build a gate to block off the path that led to the water. I grabbed my phone, called Dana, and by that afternoon, a sheriff's deputy was standing there ordering them to stop. The trail crossed lakefront property that now legally belonged to me, and they had no right to build anything without my permission. That was the moment the balance of power shifted. Word got out that the HOA had been caught trying to fence off property they didn't own, and even some of Carl's staunchest supporters started questioning his leadership. At the next HOA meeting, I didn't even have to speak. 3 neighbors stood up and demanded a vote of no confidence. Carl barely survived the vote, but his grip was weakening. Meanwhile, I doubled down. I invited local kids to go fishing with me on Saturdays. I hosted sunset bonfires on the shoreline for members who had signed access agreements. The sound of laughter and music carried across the water every weekend. A direct reminder to Carl that his little power trip had backfired spectacularly. Then, out of nowhere, I got a letter from the county. The HOA had filed a formal complaint accusing me of misusing private property and creating a public nuisance. Dana laughed when she saw it. "This is desperation," she said. "They're trying to get the county to do what they can't. Don't worry, we'll handle it." She did more than handle it. She counterfiled a motion to recover damages for the harassment I'd endured since buying the lake. That's when things went nuclear. Carl started sending out weekly emails begging the neighborhood not to give in to my tyranny. He warned that I might sell the lake to outsiders or raise the access fees sky high. But by now, most of the neighbors saw through it. The ones who had joined my access program were happily using the lake without restrictions. The ones who hadn't were starting to feel left out. By September, more than 80% of the neighborhood had signed agreements with me. HOA-sponsored events were dead, their power over the lake completely gone. At the next HOA meeting, Carl tried one last time to rally support. "If we let him keep the lake, what's next?" he shouted. "Will he start charging us to look at it?" Someone in the back of the room yelled, "I'd rather pay him than you." And the room erupted in laughter. I almost felt sorry for Carl. Almost. But I knew the fight wasn't completely over. Carl was stubborn and Sheila was petty. They wouldn't stop until they were forced out, or until I made them irrelevant once and for all. So I started planning something big. Something that would settle this once and for all and make sure no future HOA board could ever pull this stunt again. By early October, I had a plan. It wasn't enough just to outmaneuver Carl. I wanted to make sure no future HOA board could try this same power grab. So I called Dana, and together we drafted something we called the Clearwater Lake Charter. The charter was simple. It legally designated the lake as a private conservation area, under my sole ownership with controlled public access. It clearly stated that any neighborhood group wishing to use it, including the HOA, had to apply for permission annually and agree to my rules. Most importantly, it forbade any third party, including the HOA, from attempting to regulate, restrict, or interfere with its use. Once it was filed and recorded, I sent copies to every single household in the neighborhood. The reaction was instant. My inbox was flooded with thank you emails from neighbors who had grown tired of the HOA drama. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Carl sat at the front table looking pale and exhausted, and Sheila's usual smug smile was gone. I waited until public comment before standing up. "I want to make something clear," I said, holding up the charter. "The Clearwater Lake Charter is now legally binding. The HOA no longer has any authority over this lake. Not now, not ever. You cannot issue fines, you cannot restrict boats, you cannot host events without my approval. This is over!" A cheer went up from half the room. Carl slammed his gavel. "This isn't over!" he shouted. "We're taking you to court." "Please do," I said calmly. "My lawyer and I would love to explain to a judge how your board tried to gate off property you don't own and harass a legal owner for months. In fact, we've already filed for damages." That last part made the room go silent. A few minutes later, someone in the back stood up and made a motion to remove Carl as president. The vote wasn't even close. Carl was out. Sheila tried to defend him, but the crowd turned on her too. Within an hour, both of them had resigned from the board. It was over. I celebrated that weekend by hosting the biggest lake party Clearwater had ever seen. There were kayaks, paddleboards, a floating fire pit, and music echoing across the water until midnight. The neighbors who had supported me from the start came out in full force, laughing, eating, and finally enjoying the lake without fear of fines or HOA harassment. I thought Carl might try one more stunt, but he never did. He put his house up for sale a month later and moved out by Christmas. Sheila stayed, but she kept her head down and stopped making trouble. Over the winter, I had a professional install a proper sign at the entrance to the trail. It read, "Clearwater Lake Private Conservation Area Access by Owner Permission." Only underneath, in smaller letters, Owner, my name. When spring came, I decided to go one step further. I opened up a handful of lake memberships to people outside the neighborhood, just enough to cover upkeep costs and give me an excuse to host events. The HOA couldn't say a word about it. One warm May evening, I was sitting on the new floating dock with a cold beer in hand, when Hank, my neighbor, paddled over in his kayak. "Can't believe you pulled it off," he said, grinning. "Whole neighborhood's talking about how quiet it's been since Carl left. Feels like a weight's been lifted." I raised my bottle in a toast. "To peace and quiet, And no more HOA nonsense. We sat there watching the sun sink below the trees, the lake glowing gold, perfectly still except for the ripples from his kayak. Later that night, after Hank had gone home, I tied up my boat and stood at the edge of the dock, looking out at the water. It hit me then just how much had changed since that first letter showed up on my door. They'd tried to find me. They'd tried to shame me. They'd even tried to scare me. And in the end, I hadn't just won. I'd turned the tables so completely that the HOA no longer had any control at all. And as I stood there under the stars, the lake perfectly silent except for the occasional splash of a fish, I realized I finally had what I wanted all along. Freedom, no committees, no covenants. No Carl, just me, my boat, and the lake I owned outright. Forever.